deeply honored today to be speaking with Professor Paul S. Williams. Professor Williams is CEO of the British and Foreign Bible Society and research professor of marketplace theology and leadership at Regent College in Vancouver, Canada, where he previously served as full-time faculty and produced the ReFrame video curriculum with his team at the college's Marketplace Institute. Professor Williams is also author of the text that we'll be discussing today, Exiles on Mission, How Christians Can Thrive in a Post-Christian World, available from Brazos Press in Grand Rapids, Michigan from 2020. Professor Williams, thanks so much for joining us today. We're glad to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for this conversation.
Professor Williams, you've gone through a form of exile yourself. You were living as an expat in Canada, and now you've returned from exile back to London, a world that you knew well when you were working in the financial industry out of Oxford. May I just ask what that transition has been like for you?
I think we expected, my wife and I, my wife's a historian, she was teaching as well. I think we thought that it would be more of a reverse culture shock than it was. We actually found coming back and re-engaging with family very easy and being back in the culture. But what we did find was a kind of lifestyle shock. Because I'd had, I mean, you'll understand this, I'd had over a year of academic sabbatical just prior to coming back into a role where suddenly I was CEO of a reasonable sized charity and running things. I'd done that sort of work before early in my career, but it was a real lurch. And it took a while to get used to. Yeah.
Are there some things maybe about technology or the ease of communication, or I don't know what, that made that transition for y'all back to London especially workable?
I don't think so. I think that I'm not. To be honest with you, the most important thing I think for us as human beings in being able to feel settled is relationship, isn't it? We had pluses and minuses. We gained proximity and it did really help what were already good relationships with family and some of our old close friends. But the sad thing was that we lost a strong friendship network in Vancouver. And what we found was that actually our network in Britain was much more dispersed for all kinds of reasons. And so that felt very difficult. It felt like there wasn't a spiritual home to come back to in the form of a local church, for example. And we found that very difficult. It made us sort of really understand. I mean, that's a very minor experience for us, really, compared with the kind of experience that you go through as a believer if you're really in a foreign environment and you're trying to connect in with the church and you don't understand how things are done, you don't know anyone, and it's suddenly it was very difficult. We went from always being talked to and known to not being known at all and really struggling to make good relationships, deep discipleship type relationships.
May I ask if that has to do with the urban context of London? London is one of the world's great big cities, and if I'm not mistaken, Regent College is sort of in a rural suburb outside of Vancouver.
No, Regent's actually quite central in Vancouver. It's not in the downtown core, but it's very close on the university campus. So Regent College itself is in quite an urban environment. And I think if we had moved into London, we probably wouldn't have had the same experience we had. But we didn't because of the history and the role. We were nearer to Oxford in the Cotswolds, so we're in quite a rural area. Now, in the past, that would have not been an issue. It wasn't an issue in the past, but it was this time.
Well, we're super glad today to be talking to you about your book, Exiles on Mission. I read it cover to cover. It's an enjoyable book to read for those of our viewers might be considering reading it cover to cover themselves too. You do a lot of biblical work, which makes pretty much every page rewarding to read. You do theoretical things, but you also do a lot of biblical work in this. So this is an eminently practical book for pretty much any Christian living in the West, I'd say. Now, I want to take us to the beginning, where in the preface you lay out a statement that I found helpful and orienting. This book is about several things, but one of the themes that's addressed is secularization. So this is on page 13 of the prologue. You write this: since the 1960s, most of Western Europe and the former European colonies of Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas have progressively rejected Christianity, not only in terms of the formal influence of the church in public life, but also in terms of any perceived positive cultural contribution of the Christian faith. With vanishingly few exceptions, and these largely involving the shrinking conservative heartland of the United States, it is now not a cultural advantage to be known as a Christian or to engage in God talk in these societies, but rather a positive hindrance to communication and possibly detrimental to one's reputation. As you've transitioned from professor of theology in Vancouver to CEO of the British and Foreign Bible Society, how do you see secularization at work?
The book was sort of 30 years in the making, in a way. In the early 90s, I was working, as you've indicated already, in the city in London as a professional economist, in business, in strategy. And I was thinking missiologically about that. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus in this environment? How is my faith related? And it was a milieu where it really wasn't helpful to anybody to be a public Christian. And it was quite difficult. And of course, it varied between different microcultures. But in broad terms, the public discourse really was hostile to public expressions of faith, certainly connecting faith to anything like business or education or healthcare or anything that we talk about in public life. And I began to really press into how we got to that situation and how we should be responding to it. I was very influenced by meeting and then reading lots of the work of Lesslie Newbigin. And so that was the milieu that was shaping this. And I was very concerned that the responses of the church, the responses, that I was presented with, were inadequate to the situation, and that we had too easily acquiesced to Christianity as a private, personal faith, ignoring the public social dimensions of the gospel and the kingdom. So that was the milieu in which I was experiencing and theorizing, if you like. And it was the height of the New Atheist movement. It was the secularization thesis was in full sway. Now, during the course of time, and certainly by the time the book was published, the situation had moved on theoretically. But in most countries I was writing about in that paragraph, the statement was still true. But already at that point, I was seeing shifts, and they vary in different countries. So I think that we are seeing some parts of the world, and certainly I would say this of Britain, we can come back to this if you like, now as post-secular in the theoretical sense of the secularization thesis and that kind of ideological secularism.
Let's dive straight into that. Post-secular is not a term that's thrown around by social commentators. What do you mean when you say post-secular?
What I'm getting at is that the peak and passing of the peak of the influence of a secularist ideology. So the secular simply means parts of life that are not connected with religion. That's a descriptive term. But secularism is the philosophy that wants that space to increase, and secularization thesis, which is mainly what we mean in popular usage in the West when we talk about secularization, is a theory of those secularist philosophers that that secular space will inevitably grow and religion will inevitably decline in influence as societies become more modern, i.e. more Western in the late 19th, 20th century mode. And when I say post-secular, I'm saying that that thesis is discredited, is dead. The evidence against it is overwhelming. And in societies where that evidence is most widespread, the growth of a spiritual and religious space is increasing, and those spaces which can exclude faith expressions are decreasing and diminishing. That's what I mean by post-secular. And so that when I would certainly describe Britain as post-secular. It is no longer the case that it is a hostile environment to express faith in connection with public life, and it is increasingly not a powerful explanatory retort for secular humanists to try to shut you up if you try to speak as a person of faith in connection with public life. Does that make sense?
It does. In fact, I have on either side of my desk two books that I know you're familiar with. I've got Steve Bruce over here,
Yes.
teaching not too far from where you currently reside. And his other book is also on my desk, God is Dead. He's been a proponent of the secularism thesis for a long time, saying that as secularity increases, we should expect that religion will die out. Charles Taylor, not too far from where you used to teach on the other side
Yeah.
of Canada's borders, in
He's actually
Toronto.
closer to me now than he was in Vancouver. Canada's a ridiculously big country, isn't it?
Must be.
Yeah, it really is.
Charles Taylor disputes that in his book and says, no, we've got to have some more depth to this conversation. Secularity is actually a place where religion can thrive, although it does not necessarily thrive in secularity, but they're not mutually exclusive categories. Turns out arbitrating this conversation is really hard.
Yes.
What evidence do you locate to try to figure out, is secularity increasing, decreasing? What's going on?
Well, I think that one of the indicators is definitely to do with public speech, I think. So it's a hard thing to get a hard measure, a quantitative measure on. But if you look, for example, at public debates on major issues, especially issues where, let's take, say, a discussion of abortion. If you look at some of those public debates in the 80s and 90s, it's very difficult for anyone to bring a religious argument to bear and to be taken seriously in that context. But when you come to, say, the assisted dying, the euthanasia debates today, people of faith, not just Christians, Muslims as well, for example, are openly talking about their faith perspective on the meaning and value of life, and arguing with that framework explicitly alongside all kinds of other reasons and evidence. But that's part of the explicit positioning, reasoning, worldview argument that is being brought to bear in those policy environments. Now, that would have been a fairly unthinkable thing for anyone to do if they wanted to be rhetorically effective 20 to 30 years ago. And it's not that it wasn't resisted, but the resistance was relatively weak. In other words, it wasn't an effective resistance. And so it did, in fact, happen. So I think, to me, that's a very important indicator of a shift in the climate. The extent to another example we could look at is the extent to which faith is discussed in a positive way in public media, in connection not just with, let's say, private life, but public life, social life. And we've seen more and more of that happening, where the connection between faith, faith communities, social action, care for the poor and the homeless, feeding the hungry, welcoming the refugee, those sorts of things are much more evident and discussed in public media. And therefore, the spokespeople of those faith communities are able to make those connections in public in ways that were, it's not that they weren't happening before, but they were shut out. They're stories that are now being told because it's less objectionable to tell them. So these are examples of the way in which the climate's changed. It's hard to put your finger on exactly when it's a climate that's changed.
And you've been living and breathing British air for the last 4 years and working in this position that no doubt has brought you into contact with a huge number of people from a lot of different parts of society. What is going on in Britain concerning the Christian faith now?
It's 8 years that we've been back. And it has been a very significant, it's been fascinating how much has changed even in those 8 years. So part of what motivated my wife and I to return from Canada to Britain, because we didn't have to come back to Britain, we'd already made, you'd loosened your roots and moved to another culture. But part of what led us to come back was as we were praying, a conviction that we believed God was mobilizing his church in Britain for a new wave of mission there. And we just felt that we saw from afar a real concern. We had a real concern for Britain and what was going on. That encouraged us, that sense that grew into a conviction that God was going to do something. We had no idea what. So we thought, well, we want to be part of that. And so it made us very open to what would open up for us in the UK. And I think that during the time we've been back, we have seen a remarkable shift in spiritual openness at different levels. And I think I've talked about some of those in public discourse. We've had quite a few prominent atheists coming to faith and describing their faith journey in very public ways, which has been quite startling. And it's created quite a furore within the new atheist community of debate, really, where Richard Dawkins has accused some of those converts of a kind of cultural Christianity conversion. In other words, is this just a way of avoiding fanatical Islam? What is the motivation? And there have been some fascinating engagements. He said he would describe himself as a cultural Christian, which is quite a movement for him. I think it's a rhetorical move, but I'm sure it's sincere in that sense. I don't doubt his sincerity about that. But I think there's quite a shock to the new atheist world to see these prominent figures, journalists, philosophers, scientists, describing in very articulate ways why they have come to Christian faith and being quite clear under interview that it's actually an experience that's relational, that's personal, that's not just a political or even not a convenience. It's not a political move. But that, if you like, is that's quite above the radar. That would be quite well known amongst the intellectual milieu in Britain. But what's less aware is the number of, because as the leader of Bible Society, I spend a lot of time meeting church leaders from a wide range of denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, up and down the country. And what I have noticed increasing in frequency and in intensity are the stories of ordinary people, not the well-known, intellectual atheists, but just ordinary folk turning up at church, inquiring about faith. People, there's a revival going on. Really, perhaps that's an extreme word to use. The university mission agencies. There's two big mission works in Britain involved with university students. They are basically saying we have never experienced the level of openness and the rate of conversion to Christianity amongst the university age students that ever before, in living memory, that we're having right now. Amongst slightly older age groups, you've got all kinds of sort of millennial age folk who perhaps have been exploring psychedelics, substance abuse of one sort or another, alcohol, new age sort of crystal meditation, who are turning up at church, or in some cases having dreams of Jesus, which is absolutely astonishing. It's the kind of story that we are used to hearing occasionally of Muslims or Hindus who have a dream of Jesus and then go looking to figure out what this is and end up in a church. So to hear these stories repeated by people in these communities is utterly surprising and remarkably exciting. So I think it's a range of things like that, and we have tried. I'm sure that many of your listeners will be like me. I'm not going to put this on you, Jonathan. I am absolutely allergic to traditional street evangelism. It's the last thing I want to do. But I have had a couple of experiences in the last few years where I thought, right, I have to have a go along with others, with partners of Bible Society and so forth. And what has surprised me is that yes, there's been some hostility, but there's been a lot more openness than I expected. And that really did surprise me.
Oh boy, I've got to investigate more. That's remarkable. I graduated from college in 1999, so the new atheist movement was something that was a strong part of the story during my graduate studies and early adult life. This is amazing to hear what's going on and not too far away from us in the British Isles. If I can dig straight into your book, one of the questions that you're dealing with here is what does it mean to live out a Christian faithful witness in this secular contemporary world that we're dealing with? And you structure the book into three parts,
Yeah.
and you appeal to a nice solid foundation, faith, hope, and love. So part one is called Enduring Faith, Christians in the Contemporary World. And some of there you tease out what is modernity, what does this exile look like, etc. And then in the second part, Fostering Hope from Alien to Ambassador, part three, Ambassadors of Love, Exiles on Mission. And I'd like to go into that second part where you talk about what this means to move from a position of alien to ambassador. If we're going to be effective in our missionary testimony to our own cultures in the West, we need to adopt this new identity as an ambassador, not just an alien. What are the obstacles that keep us from doing this effectively?
Put very simply, poor discipleship, our lack of rootedness in scripture and prayer means that our imagination is not sufficiently biblical. But I know that's a kind of an obvious and simple way of putting it, but I do think it's a very important one to draw, because I think it's the underlying reason why we've been drawn into believing the secularization thesis, for example. So many church leaders that I meet are very disheartened because they bought into this idea of inevitable decline, and almost like they're managing decline. And that, there's been so much public criticism of Christianity, so much public criticism of the Bible. Christians are kind of embarrassed almost to be associated with something that's regarded by some, at least, a vocal minority, as a sort of intolerant, homophobic, racist, sexist, authoritarian, oppressive force. Now, that's not many people think that, but they're very vocal. And somehow we've bought into that. We feel that. We're therefore very afraid, and we feel marginalized. And there's a sort of memory still, because it's not that many generations ago. Most of our grandparents would remember a time when it was a cultural advantage to be a Christian. Christianity was more publicly respected. People might not believe it, but they certainly respected people who were Christian. And so there's been a huge shift in, if you like, the social reputation and power afforded to Christians, and we're feeling alienated. And we kind of feel like we've been pushed out. And so this leads to these dysfunctional responses. We get angry. We try to hold on to things like, prayer in schools or something like that. It's not that those are bad things, and it'd be better if they were there, probably. But holding on to something from that previous era is not going to be missionally effective until we understand what it is that this particular moment is yearning for. We've now reached the point where the yearning outweighs the longing, the hope, the sense of a meaning crisis outweighs the anger about the previous position that led us to reject Christianity in the first place. And I think this is a very important shift, because that I'm seeing across the West, but it's particularly come to a fruition in Britain at this time, where secularity reaches a certain peak, but then I think in Britain there are a number of things in any culture. It's a highly complex thing to analyze, but COVID was for sure a watershed where it really brought to light that things aren't really, this narrative isn't working. The stories we're telling ourselves about purpose and meaning and happiness and success in life just aren't working, and people start looking elsewhere. That's the critical shift in the climate, because if you remember, the definition of secular, straightforward descriptively, is things that are not connected to religion. The reality is that if human beings are, in fact, have a spiritual dimension, as well as a material and an intellectual dimension, everything is connected to spiritual things, which is kind of what religion is about, right? So we can tell ourselves a lie that we can base our entire society on purely naturalistic, materialistic assumptions. But if in fact our nature is also spiritual as well as material, eventually that lie won't work. And I think it's finally been exposed, is being exposed, and people are then rushing off to look for something. And they haven't, many of them have no idea where to look. So the crucial thing is that the church is ready at this time of enormous opportunity. So in a way, the passion for me in the book is in the section from alien to ambassador is this is our moment. This is our moment of opportunity. And we're still sort of dysfunctionally feeling alienated about the past. We've really got to get over it because our identity as believers is to be exiles anyway, as citizens of heaven sent back into the world on Christ's behalf as his witnesses. So we've got to get over the shift that kind of moved us away from this place of cultural power. For most of its history, Christianity has not been in the center. And when we have been in the center, we have not always done a terribly good job. So we've probably got things to repent of, but we've got to get over it and focus on the kingdom in breaking today in this environment, which is different to the past.
Amazing. You said two things that really stuck with me. One is that there's a crisis. The crisis in meaning now outweighs people's suspicion, maybe,
Yes.
of the church as an organization. Of course, there have been many legitimate criticisms made of Christianity. There's also been lots and lots of non-legitimate criticisms made, but they're willing to perhaps set aside their suspicion because this desire to find meaning, transcendence, God, if he exists, is so great. That's amazing. And then also, boy, that was an important thing you said when you said we've got to get over, and you used that phrase a couple times, our hurt from being representatives of this church, which is under such suspicion. And I resonate with that. I think, boy, there's a lot of us who are afraid to try to be vocal about our faith because we're still licking our wounds. I want to dive into a little further in the book. This is out of page 112. You write a very provocative paragraph there. It happens to be on the topic of theological education. You've had a career change now. And as you look back at your work in theological education, you see how much change needs to be brought to those institutions. I've also had a career change. I'm also no longer directly working in theological education. This particularly interested me. You write this: in the West, the curriculum for pastors in training, note that it has never been apostles or prophets or evangelists in training, is dominated by biblical studies, systematic theology, and church history. Together, these account for around 70% of most programs. Almost none of this content will develop any sustained reflection on mission, contemporary culture, or the workplace, though it could. Almost all of it, at least in Protestant schools, is substantially biased towards the theological agenda of the Reformation. This is particularly ironic, given the Reformers' recovery of vocation theology for all arenas of work, set against the persistent marginalization of a theology of work in the seminary curriculum. So if we can imagine that you were sitting around a boardroom table and that someone somehow gave you the power to change theological educations across the board, what would be on the top of your agenda items for reform in theological seminaries?
I'm glad you asked this question because I think this is vital for us right now. This is really vital. I think we're at a moment now which is akin to what Bonhoeffer was doing at Finkelwalder in making sure that there was a cadre of leaders who were really formed deeply and understood the cost of discipleship. That was what enabled the confessing church to withstand the sort of horrific political pressure of the Nazi regime. And we are going to need that level of rootedness over the coming years. So being taught to pray, not theologizing about prayer, but being taught to pray, being discipled in practices of prayer that we can sustain, number one. Focusing on learning to read, and some of the things I talk about in the book, learning to read contemporary society. and understanding the missiological possibilities and learning how to translate, how does the gospel translate into these different parts of life? Because these are the people, if they are, for the most part, people who go to seminaries are going to end up leading churches. What we want them to be able to do is have a vision for mission in contemporary society that they can impart to the congregants and empower them, right? They're equipping the saints for the work in all of the spheres of life. So we have to turn around the idea that the congregants in the pew are there to do church programs, and understand that the church is there to equip that frontline missionary workforce in all of the different spheres of life. So that needs to be embedded in the curriculum, understanding the culture and the different spheres and how the gospel translates. And some of this is not necessarily like ditching studying history, but it's a way of studying. History is a brilliant discipline if it's taught the right way for understanding how believers in different time periods have contextualized the gospel in society as a whole. But so often we don't look at that. We look at this very, very, very narrow ecclesiastical history, which doesn't really do that much to help us missiologically. And third, I think getting some practice in equipping and communicating those things. And then finally, a plea that anyone in a local church who's been in the business world will immediately resonate with, which is actually training church leaders how to lead teams, how to run something, so that they don't have to be brilliant at it. They just need to be adequate. And so often they're really at sea, and some small improvements would make a big missiological difference. With church leaders understanding how to build teams and delegate. Wow, would that make a difference in local churches? So those would be my, I think, sort of 4 big areas. If I had the magic wand, but I do hope that if there are people involved in leading seminaries listening to this, that we take seriously the discipleship, the seriousness we need to take. Local church leaders, the seriousness we must take now while we can, while we have freedoms. There's an openness. There will be a backlash. This is a spiritual dynamic in societies. We must dig deep, and then we will be able to stand. Then we will be able to hold our ground.
Early in this section, you talk about cultural stories and the church's need to learn, if we're to be missionally effective, to learn how to read these cultural stories. You also tip us off that Lesslie Newbigin was an important part of your own learning how to do this. Tell me about Lesslie Newbigin's books and what they meant in your early development as a theologian.
I was introduced to Lesslie Newbigin personally by a family friend at a really important time in my life when I was trying to decide, kind of in my 20s, what am I going to do with the rest of my life, kind of thing. The wonderful grand questions that we have in our 20s. And I'd been really dissatisfied with the answers I'd had to this question of how do I connect my interest in early work as an economist, and I'm thinking about economic systems, and I'm trying to think about how do I think Christianly about that. I was very dissatisfied with that. I also was struggling with the local church. When I read my Bible, it seemed like the church was a big deal for God, right? And yet I was feeling in my arrogance as a 20-year-old like this is a a hopeless institution most of the time. I mean, okay, so nice people there, but is it really going to do anything to change the world? And yet when I read the Bible, the answer is yeah. So I'm really struggling with these sorts of questions in my 20s. And when I met Lesslie Newbigin, I think what really impacted me from him and in reading his work was, first of all, this insistence that yes, the gospel is either false or true at all times. That we either orient our whole way of thinking about the world around the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and therefore everything else that implies, or it's not true at all. I mean, and Paul says something similar, doesn't he, in 1 Corinthians 15? But Newbigin's real push on the Western church was, you guys have capitulated to the secularization ideologues and accepted this withdrawal. And so that had a big impact on. The other thing that I can remember engaging with him about was just how relational God is, the Bible is, in its expression, and how God reveals himself to us in such incredibly personal and relational ways, even down to, I remember having a discussion with him when he had a go at me for using the phrase timeless truth. And I said, but surely there's timeless truths in the Bible. And I quoted back to him the Ten Commandments. And he was very agitated about this, because he said, but the Ten Commandments are introduced in the context of the relationship that Israel has with a covenant God. And, so it's, is it true always that we shouldn't murder? Yes. But how is that life-giving in a society in connection with an understanding of the character of the God who's giving that command? So I think these are some of the things that really influence me, and probably that last point, the way I think about epistemology, it's led me into some of the personalism, Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge. This will be some of your listeners will understand where I'm going with this, but I think that very personal, relational way of understanding the human being, our relationship with God and the whole world, is so infused in Scripture, and yet it's very anti-modern. And so I think it's a very helpful way when we come to reframe the Gospel's encounter with our context, to start with that relational understanding of human nature, our relationship with others and God, that infuses the way that we should be thinking about, in a biblical imagination, healthcare, law, education, business, etc.
The third section of the book is called Ambassadors of Love, Exiles on Mission. And I did my best to summarize that in a statement or two. So you can tell me if I got it right or if I didn't. But here goes. This section provides a sustained exploration of the biblical theme of exile. You note that the arc of the Bible's message to us as God's pilgrim people is to resist both the temptation to retreat permanently from the world, as well as the temptation to assimilate to the world. Rather, the Bible calls us to live as ambassadors of God's love to the world. Well, did I get it right? And more importantly, how is this message of what the Bible teaches us about what it means to live as an exile on mission, how does that shape your current work as a CEO of the British and Foreign Bible Society?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description, because I think love, faith expressing itself through love, when we come to engage any particular context, this is very much about being, this third section is about what does it mean then? How do I live out my life? Rooted in this identity in Christ, I'm a citizen, my citizenship is in heaven. I am signaling, representing the inbreaking kingdom. How does that work out in practice? And I think love as the center of that is a really helpful framing, because it means that, first of all, there's a hospitality. Love frames a hospitality. There's an invitational, welcoming posture that we can adopt at our desk. We might have very little influence. We might have in our sphere of influence, culturally, it might be we walk around the park with our kids. We have a junior job, but we have a desk or a laptop somewhere. We're part of a retail a process or manufacturing process. We're a driver. Of course, we might have more responsibility and have teams and so forth, and that is easily extended. But how, first of all, do I say, as far as I can, I invite you, Jesus, to be sovereign in this place, this environment that I am working in, and help me express the love and the welcome to anyone who comes in. Because the more junior we are, but perhaps the more senior we are, the more intentional we need to be about this. People are going to come into our space. What will they encounter? Now, our roles in working environments will determine certain things that we have to do and that we can't do. But the tone, the quality of those relationships how can they be infused with love? How can there be something of the taste of the kingdom experienced when people come in to the space that we have some control over? So I think love starts like that, but then it begins to reach out, because it begins to reach out to understand the other and where they're coming from. That's a loving thing to do. I give the example of Daniel. The very beginning of Daniel, we learn that he learnt the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now, at one level, he had to, but at another level, he excelled at it. He was brilliant at it. He was better than all the astrologers of Babylon. Why was that? God anointed him and he gave himself to it. And it's an expression of love. We know this. If we go to a foreign culture, or we make the effort, even in a hesitating way, to speak the local language, and we get it wrong, the people feel honored that we made the effort to speak in their language. And as believers, one of the ways we express love is to understand the other before we start speaking, so that our message, which is vital, can be translated into something that makes sense in their cultural world, in their cultural context. So this motive of love, I think, helps us. People often want a principle. I talk to many audiences of people in business and professional life. They want principles, but love doesn't really get reduced to a principle. It's so contextual. To cross the bridge to understand the other, in a sense, that is the principle. Love listens. Love seeks to understand the other. And from that place, we then can translate in an effective way.
Professor Williams, if I can ask one final question to close the interview. It's a question that we've asked almost every guest who's been on this program, and we've been running it for almost a decade now. But there's a question about this. What would it mean for the church to be reunited? This program is a way of calling theologians together from around the world to help us imagine what would it be like if the church were to be reunited, especially in light of Jesus' prayer in John 17, that we all be one. What would that mean?
I've come to see the importance of that prayer of Jesus, and to really pray it myself, to get really committed to it during the course of my Christian life. I probably treated it almost like a, apple pie, motherhood and apple pie type statement. But now I've begun to see, actually, no, this is really crucial, because it expresses what we were just talking about, love one another. So if we don't love one another, people aren't going to find it credible that we are fundamentally going to be loving towards them, or that we're receiving love. We manifest the truth of the love of Christ when we are seen to be loving one another. I think my experience as CEO of Bible Society has been extraordinary in this respect, because I've had the privilege of traveling around the world, not only in Britain, but meeting Christians, local church leaders, denominational leaders, and Christian leaders in general, from across the spectrum of Christian traditions, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, all coming together in so many different contexts: in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in the context of communist China, of course, in the West, coming together around the Bible. Bible societies were kind of designed by the founders, the Clapham sect, to be existing on the intersection of denominations, public and private, clergy and laity. And so it's sort of in the DNA of the Bible Society movement. And many of my colleagues around the world take it for granted, but it's been extraordinary to experience. And so the practical answer is, read the Bible together. Is a very powerful thing. Learning to pray together, starting simple. Worshipping together. That's a bit harder, because we sing different kinds of songs, but having the humility to have some mixture and think about something that's not alienating. But, worship is not just the song. It's also thanksgiving and praise. And one of the ways we can worship together is tell the stories of what God is doing in our communities and traditions. This is something I've seen quite electric. We've been at certain, we often try to host these interconfessional gatherings as Bible Society. And I've had so many people come up to me afterwards from, let's say, often it's the Protestant or the evangelicals who will say these things, but I have had comments like this from Orthodox and Catholic believers too. I had no idea that God was at work, like that in that church, and they're just quite astonished, but enormously encouraged. I've never been in a gathering with believers from such a diverse range of traditions. For many people, I've never been in a gathering. This is an indictment, but it's true. I've never been in a gathering with such racial diversity. So I think that what it does is it really raises our faith. So in some ways, it can feel like a luxury in the West because we have so much freedom. But I can tell you that it's survival in the Middle East. It's survival. It's existential. So when the Bible Society, I won't say which Bible Society, but when the Bible Societies, different Bible Societies in the Middle East have been able to gather the Christian community in a country for some sort of gathering, conference, festival, and the young people see the church leaders from the different traditions saying the Lord's Prayer on a platform, suddenly their faith goes up, not just a bit, but many, many notches, because all of a sudden, I am not alone in this tiny, tiny, tiny community that's in such a hostile environment. There is a community here that's diverse, and that we're following Jesus together. Yes, we have different ways of doing baptism and thinking about the Eucharist and so forth, but we love Jesus. We're coming together around the Bible. We can pray together, and we're working to see the kingdom come in our society. It's very electric, but we have to make the effort. So we're running something in Britain called Intercultural Church with a whole bunch of different, we're trying to really break down some of the racial divides, which are largely relational, and there are hurts, not ideologies, but hurts and past wrongs that really need to be overcome by being together. Learning to be together, learning to actually actively love and include and listen and learn from one another. And it's really powerful. And everyone comes away a winner. But I think we think of it as a luxury. It's not a luxury. This is right at the top of Jesus' priority for us. Let's not wait till it's an existential requirement.
It's been our huge privilege today to be speaking with Professor Paul S. Williams, author of the text that we've been discussing today, Exiles on Mission, How Christians Can Thrive in a Post-Christian World, and also CEO of the British and Foreign Bible Society. Professor Williams, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really enjoyed our conversation.